You're listening to the Cricket Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cricket Podcast for part 2 of this week's episode. Or this day's episode. I don't know if we might do another show later in the week. We have a couple of big topics three big topics for this part. We've got IPL coaching changes with 2 new men stepping into roles there. We've got Australia's World Cup squad, and we have India's less than triumphant T20 series in the West Indies. Before we get into all of that, if you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on Spotify, Apple, wherever, hit like, leave a review, give us 5 stars, hit the thumbs up, subscribe, tell your friends, and help us grow the podcast. And if you want to go a little bit further and really support the show, you can by signing up at patreon.com/thecricketpod. Ross, where do you want to start here? We've got IPL stuff. We haven't talked about the IPL for a while. Australia's World Cup squad, that's sort of newer, but also India losing, and that was it's kind of funny, isn't it?
It is funny, and I'm going to definitely say, if you leave a review, I will read it out on the show, and I'll name check you. So that's the incentive to do it. Let's go Australia first, because Australia they've made a nice omission, a welcome omission, I think, from when we were talking about white ball cricket beforehand, and they've dropped Marnus Labuschagne, and they've got I think they go to South Africa first, then they go to India, and then it's the World Cup. So it's kind of a preliminary team, but Marnus Labuschagne has been dropped. Steve Smith, because how good he is against spin, I can imagine, and that's why he's kind of in the ODI squad, and just generally he's Steve Smith. But they've also they've got pretty strong squads, Jack. Like this Australia ODI team, like you look down the list of these, but they've got like a lot of talent in that space. Obviously they are a force to be reckoned with at any World Cup, and have won the title on numerous occasions, but I think they should be quite quietly confident, the Australians here.
I quite like Australia's squad as well, and I think for me one of the big questions going into this World Cup is, from an Australia point of view, is actually whether they would try and shoehorn Marnus Labuschagne into the team. I think it's a fantastic decision to basically not pick him. He has a dreadful record in ODI cricket. 847 runs on an average of 31, strike rate of 83, and his stats in List A cricket, so domestic 50 over or 40 over stuff, mainly 50 over, not much better. Average of 32 at 85, nowhere near the level. I think you get him out of there and it enables you to really play more of the excellent players. Don't mind Steve Smith at all. I think Steve Smith's a pretty capable ODI player. I don't think he's amazing, but he scores a decent number of runs, not slowly enough that it's a huge problem. So, yeah. And the only other bit of news with them is obviously that the cum dog, Pat Cummins, he's broken his wrist, hasn't he? Fielding, I think, in the 5th test of the Ashes, and so will be sitting out. He's their captain for the World Cup. So and they said who it would be. They said one of Smith, Marsh, Josh Hazlewood, or Alex Carey. Really narrowing it down to half the eligible players will be captain.
I think it'll be Bison. It'll be the big Bison. I think he takes on the T20 stuff anyway. Yeah, so it'll be old Mitch Marsh, and I don't hate that, right? But they've got a couple of people who have not been around the squad too frequently. They've got Hardy in there. They've got, is it Tanvir Sangha as well, the young leg spinner. Again, we thought they might actually end up trying to pick someone like Nathan Lyon, didn't we, in terms of if they pressed the kind of panic button. But they resisted that urge, and kind of Ashton Agar, Adam Zampa and Sangha. So I think it's, a pretty good, Sangha would be a pretty good lineup.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a squad that I think on paper they're the 3rd best team in the competition, and I think they picked a squad that looks like they're zeroing in on the on paper best 11 or best 13, because they'll probably chop and change a little bit, and that's fair enough. So if you're an Australian, I think you can be relatively happy with how things are shaping up. There. Anything else on the Aussie squad that you wanted to say, or World Cup in general?
It would just be, I think, just to be interesting to see kind of how the teams do kind of chop and change on this front. So you've obviously it's in India. If I'm right, is it in India? It is in India.
Yeah.
And you are going to see teams who like when they go to India to play Test match cricket, will start to think around, well, actually, we're going to pick a slightly different dynamic. And actually, I think that's quite an interesting piece here. And you might see some bigger names actually miss out because of their dreadful record against spin, or you might see just actually, you know what, we need some more bowlers in this side, and you might see a pacer or two that you like not going as well. So, yeah, over the next kind of month or so where the teams are getting announced, I think it's going to be quite interesting across the board.
Yeah, I agree. I'm looking forward to that. Right, other two topics, Ross: India in the West Indies and the IPL coaching merry-go-round. Which one do you want to go to next?
Let's go to the IPL first, because the IPL, we obviously talked a lot about the 100, talked a bit about the Blast. The IPL is obviously the premier competition across the world, and I like the fact that it's kind of increasingly turning out like the Football League, right? So the Football Premier League, like we are chopping and changing. It's becoming more cutthroat, and kind of when we were previewing it before, Jack, I think we said that was kind of going to be the mantra. And here, like Hessen at RCB, you say he's done a pretty reasonable job over the last 4 years. Or is it 3 playoff appearances, kind of a lost final, and you're kind of sitting there going, do you know what? It's kind of as good as RCB probably could have expected, and yet the kind of chop has kind of come in that space. Justin Langer has come in at Lucknow with Andy Flower kind of going to RCB. That's it's an interesting merry-go-round on those, I think, because Andy Flower's got a pretty formidable record. Lucknow kind of didn't have the best of seasons last year, but kind of some injuries to obviously King Legend, etc., kind of hampered on that space. And is Justin Langer really the person you want around kind of a T20 kind of franchise? Don't know. But we're going to find out, and it's going to be the kind of Aussie focus yet again, and we'll, I think, see some pretty interesting cricket, and interesting styles.
You said Lucknow didn't have a great season. They won 8 matches and qualified for the playoffs. It wasn't. I mean, I think they were.
It's a good season, but it's
yeah. They petered out a little bit, didn't it? I think, as you said, the injuries. They had that game where Mark Wood took a load of wickets, and it was like, oh, holy smokes, this team's going to be pretty exciting. And by the end of the tournament, it was like, oh, there's 8 men, someone on crutches. And
they turned into cannon fodder, really, didn't they? They literally, it was almost like they had a really clear identity going into it, and then it kind of, as you say, like petered out. And that's what I mean by like they had an opportunity to win it, and I think they let themselves down a little bit. And then there's also another change, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Dan Vettori in for Sunrisers Hyderabad, and I think that's I think that will be a pretty good move. Brian Lara, his coaching credentials, to be kind, were quite poor. And Daniel Vettori's not. Daniel Vettori has got a lot of experience around the world. He has done a good job at a few franchises. He's well respected. He understands the job of a head coach and how that fits in, and how you kind of enable players, and how you bring in analysts, and how you build a squad and pick an 11 for a whatever match day it is, and take into consideration conditions and things like that. And then he's got all the sort of wealth of experience that he had himself as a captain to sort of rely on as well. I think this is actually a pretty good move from Sunrisers. The concern I would have, as always, with Sunrisers is whether they're actually going to enable him to do his job. And with Brian Lara, I think him being a bad coach was definitely a factor in them playing badly last year. But it's sort of an open secret that if you're the head coach of Sunrisers, you don't necessarily pick the team.
Which is bonkers, right? Absolutely bonkers.
Now, the question is whether having somebody with a bit more experience like Daniel Vettori, who is potentially less likely to put up with that kind of nonsense than kind of like a hand-picked stooge, as Brian Lara and the Muralitharan duo sort of were, whether that will transform them, and whether this is sort of a signal of them changing that approach away from kind of like a fantasy cricket owner medley nonsense set up towards something a little bit more professional, whether this is just like another fucking thing that the Sunrisers are going to do on their way to finishing 9th out of 10 is up for debate. But they have, I mean, like on paper, quite a good team. Put a good coach in there and think about what they're doing a little bit more, and there's no reason why this shouldn't be a team competing at least for the playoffs. I mean, I think in our predictions last year we had them right up the top, in sort of top 2 or 3. Didn't turn out like that because of basically bad decisions and
Couldn't pick the right 11, could they? Right? They couldn't pick the right 11.
They weren't helped by the fact that nobody could bat. Like Markram had a terrible season, and Harry Brook had a terrible season, and Agarwal was pretty pants, wasn't he? And they messed around with Abhishek and Rahul Tripathi. You know what happened to him. Like some of this isn't the coach's fault, but also those guys were going up and down the order like a fucking yo-yo. Like it's not they didn't have a game plan, and I think bringing someone like Daniel Vettori in who has an idea about how T20 cricket works should in theory be an interesting one. I'm actually, I'm most interested by Flower at RCB. Now he in the game is really well regarded, and
I think it's quite a coup actually, if I'm perfectly honest, for them.
He's known for like being detailed and thorough and really studying the game, and that's probably an area where I would say RCB have come up short. Like they picked some weird 11s and asked players to do sort of odd things, and the recruitment isn't always super smart. But
this is the bit I find really interesting, Jack, because this is like kind of coming back to the Premier League people alignment. Like there's always a bit where people say this isn't my squad, this isn't my squad of what we're doing. But now you're bringing in coaches, which actually in cricket's just slightly different, right? They're going to have to do with that. They've got the mini auction, and it adds a whole fresh dynamic to what happens in that space. And so I think you're spot on.
What I thought was really interesting, go back to Hales. Hales did an interview, and they were talking about Andy Flower. I'm not sure why Andy Flower came up. Is he the coach at Trent Rockets or something like that?
Probably.
Yeah. So we're talking about Andy Flower, and Hales was saying one of his skills is being able to pick the best squad for the conditions, which sounds pretty dumb, but we've all seen teams and coaches and stuff pick bad squads for the conditions. That happens all the time in cricket, and I would say that's a thing that RCB are kind of guilty of over the years is not picking an 11 which makes sense for where they're about to play a game, whether that's at home with the tiny boundaries and sort of going in with two batters, or where we'll go to the checkbook and play one spinner. It's sort of that sort of nonsense. I would expect to see sort of less of that. The other thing with Andy Flower is he has won a boatload of stuff in his career. He was one really good player back in the day, probably Zimbabwe's best ever. So from a credibility point of view, he's got that in the bank too. In Test cricket with England, fantastic. I think he won the T20 World Cup as well. And then since then on the franchise circuit has picked up a stack of trophies, obviously being competitive with luck now for 2 years in a row as well in the IPL. And I think in a dressing room where there probably are a couple of egos, and where there's an owner who's probably got a bit of an ego as well, having somebody who can in some senses be the bigger dog. I don't think he really plays the kind of England hard man role anymore. I think he's a bit more mellow, but there's a serious
this is how you do it. This is how you do it. Are you going to trust me? You brought me in to do this job. Are you actually going to trust me to get you to the promised land?
And I think, look, RCB, when they do eventually win the IPL, because it's a 10-team league, right? And the odds are eventually it's going to happen. That would be a really big story in cricket. And I think they probably made themselves more likely to do that with Flower in charge. But, he's also, fighting against the clock with a couple of his players in terms of age, and their...
Maybe that's what happened, right? Maybe it's that bit of can we get the most out of Virat Kohli over the next 2 years and see if we can get the championship?
And Faf, as well. So we'll see. I think that's interesting. And it's a shame we're quite a long way out from the IPL, because I like talking about it, but good to get a bit of content in. Ross, we finish off then. India in the West Indies. It's not a series I don't think anyone in the world really cares about that much, but it is quite funny that India have lost the first two T20s. They went down by 4 runs. In actually a pretty exciting game, the first one, chasing 149. It went down to the last ball of the match, and India's number 11. Was it Mukesh Kumar, the number 11? Came in and had to hit a boundary to win. I think he had to hit a 6 to win. Couldn't do it. Bottled it, I would say. And so they lost by 4 runs. Then in the next match, West Indies...
What's he in the team, by the way? Why is he in this team? He's not good enough to be in this team.
I think he's actually taken some wickets. So,
I still don't think he's that good.
I don't mind playing a reserve seamer in the West Indies when your other seamers are injured and there's a World Cup coming up. In the second match, West Indies batted second. Sorry, they were chasing 152 and they won it 8 wickets down. So they won by 2 wickets. They showed India how to keep your calm under pressure as they took that home. And it prompted probably my favourite tweet of the year from the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. I'm very worried, this is quoting them, I'm very worried about the state of Indian cricket. To see this decline is sad. Maybe they should disband. All that money and so many L's. This is a very serious situation. That's currently been seen 583,000 times. It's been retweeted 686 times. And 289 people have replied to basically say I didn't get the joke, which is good. Any thoughts on this series, Ross?
Just like, what are India trying to achieve here? This is what I don't understand. And they've, since Dravid has come in, they've been doing this more and more and more. And I think there is a bit around giving people the opportunity to shine, but there is also that bit of just being like, what are you actually trying to achieve? And I think that one makes it difficult for the players. It makes it difficult for kind of the coaching staff, and it makes it even difficult for the fans to actually get involved and actually follow what's going on here, right? I think it's fantastic the West Indies have managed to kind of show them up a little bit, but just like the role definition is all over the shop here. They've changed captains. You've had kind of Rohit Sharma and Virat Kohli in the ODIs batting at like 7 and 8, kind of like. And I think when we're kind of crying out for kind of teams to come and travel around the world and actually build up, whether it's Test cricket or whether it's going to making sure that there's money coming into it, I don't know, it's just a bit disrespectful is kind of how I read the whole thing. And when you're only a few months out, I know it's kind of T20 cricket, but when you're only a few months out from a World Cup, you want to be having your players together and actually going, right, building that confidence to actually land and start to do really well at a tournament. And I'm not sure this type of preparation does that.
I think there's two sides to this. I think the T20s are kind of irrelevant. A 5-match T20 series at this point. When's the next World Cup? Is it this next year? Isn't it?
Yeah, it's next year. Yeah, no, I agree on that front.
It gives people the chance. It gives people the chance to play in the conditions maybe for the World Cup, but whatever. And it, I don't really care if you rest bowlers. What I did think was weird, and I think your point holds more true for the ODIs. Where, as you said, Kohli and Virat batted at 7 and 8 in one of the matches. And I know it was like they were pounding West Indies, so it didn't really matter. But I do think with a World Cup coming up just around the corner, playing players in the order that they will bat in the World Cup and taking the games slightly more seriously as though they're actual World Cup warm-up matches would be beneficial, particularly from the batting side. Like with the bowling, like we know that Bumrah's going to come back in, and that's a no-brainer. We know Siraj is the world number 1 in ODI cricket at the moment. No-brainer that you're picking him. I think they need to decide which spinner they go with. So that's an open debate, and they're probably going to bring. Well, Shami might play some of the games. Maybe you play them all. Depends on Hardik, probably that one. And I think the bowling's sort of more settled, but the batting, like. It genuinely does matter which order people bat in and what role they're batting in.
Yeah, because King Legend's also on coming back.
Well, yeah, and I don't think they really use the series as an audition to see whether there's a replacement to King Legend or who the backup should be, or as a way to work out who bats where.
Sky actually bats if at all in the ODI
he was all the way up and down the order. I mean, it's they sort of used him as a finisher in one of the matches. I think he batted up the order in one of the matches. It's like, boys, this is take it a bit more seriously.
Yeah, and I think this is
lost one of those ODIs as well. West Indies not even going to the World Cup. They managed to lose.
And I think it is just, it must be frustrating being an India fan, and you're kind of looking in here like they've got a massive opportunity to win the World Cup, and they're probably favourites, right, on their home soil. But here it was an opportunity,
even with all of this, yeah.
But there is that bit of like, you can win all the bilateral series you like in the other years where you don't have a World Cup, but if it comes to these are the ones that are actually important, I think.
Yeah, now they're like, we'll just rest all our players, which is weird. I mean, like, if you look at, we talked about Australia, we opened this segment with a chat about Australia's World Cup. They are more likely to win the World Cup because of their preparations and the squad they've named and, the direction of travel there. I would say the way India are lining up so far, less likely to win the World Cup. And, what have they got, a series against Ireland coming up? is that really what you're doing? You're dedicating your time to? No disrespect to Ireland, yeah, but that's a bit of a curveball, isn't it? So basically, India have warmed up by playing two teams that aren't even going to be there, and then presumably they're going to jam it. I think they play Australia as like the final leg before the tournament starts. It's an odd way of going about things. Ross, I think we're pretty much done, aren't we?
Yep, we are indeed.
Right, cool. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. As I said earlier, do like and subscribe. Follow the Cricket Pod on whichever platform you absorb our
Follow
content
us on.
from. Yeah. And you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, the Cricket Pod on most of them. So do that, and you can sign up to Patreon, patreon.com/the Cricket Pod. Ross, I'll see you later.
Bye, everybody.